So, soil, what plants want, what you can and can't do about it. The goal is to give you enough accurate information about how the world is actually built so you can make good decisions about what to do with your own soil. Good science-based information to make wise decisions. So we've got an outline. We're organized. We're going to define some basic terms. Some of this will be surprising, so pay attention. What plants want from soil is based on what plants are, and they're very different from humans. We'll look at soil characteristics. We'll urge you to get smart about what you really have. We'll look at protecting soil, improving soil, which is easy, and at building new soil, which is disruptive and hard, not appropriate for many situations. We'll look at a surprising problem that foils most gardeners. We'll look at clay soils, compacted soils, raised beds, and maintaining existing landscapes. And then we'll remind you of what you heard. But it wouldn't be real class if it didn't start with a pop quiz. True, false, all plants need soil? No, they don't. Dirt equals soil, soil equals dirt? Nope. Fertilizer is plant food? No. Adding compost is a long-term fix? Unfortunately, no. Adding plant food or fertilizer is a long-term fix? Nope. Adjusting soil pH is a long-term fix? It is not. And after you've optimized your soil, it will stay that way. And it won't. So, talking about soil has a problem. All the important terms have multiple and often contradictory meanings. Let's start with dirt. Any or all parts of what makes up the ground. But we also use the term to describe unclean substances, embarrassing information, anything worthless or contemptible. Soil. Ground isn't homogeneous. It comes in layers. The bottom layer is bedrock. Geologic forces, lots and lots of time, work on the bedrock, slowly breaking it down. And so frequently right above the bedrock, we find a layer of broken rocks, some large, some small, usually called parent material. And above that, we find the two layers that are really important to us as gardeners. Both are the same bedrock. Now it's finally pulverized. The soil layer is a combination of subsoil and organic matter. The subsoil layer right beneath it is the same stuff, but it has little or no organic matter. You could think of subsoil as potential or future soil. It doesn't have the necessary organic matter yet, but it could in the future. The soil layer is surprisingly thin. Usually around the world, the soil layer's a few inches to a foot or so thick. The subsoil layer is usually much thicker. And soil is where the roots are. Very few roots, even tree roots, actually grow into the subsoil, and we'll talk about why. And sometimes the soil's just too thin to support what we ask it to do. If the soil for the tree on the right had been a couple feet thick, it probably would have been thick enough. It looks like about 8 inches, and that just wasn't enough. Native soil. Two legit meanings. It can mean unamended soil, or on a job where fill dirt is being used, then the native soil is the dirt that's not fill dirt. And potting mix or planting mix. Bark, pumice, peats, sphagnum, perlite, manure compost, green waste compost, lots of organic matter. But it's not soil because it has no subsoil. Organic matter. So we're going to take a little bit more time with this one. Cornell fact sheet number 41 says, soil organic matter is the fraction of the soil that consists of plant or animal tissue in various stages of decomposition. And that sounds right. And it comes in 3 flavors. The living is made up of the organisms that call soil their home. Bacteria, fungi, viruses, algae, moles, rabbits, woodchucks, plant roots, etc. They're all living organic matter. And it has 3 roles. It mixes up the organic matter into the soil, it stabilizes soil aggregates, and it makes new chemicals. The dead part is made up of the fresh residues, including dead microorganisms, dead earthworms, old plant crops, old plant roots, recently added manures, And it has a couple of roles. It's the main food source for the live organisms, and it improves soil structure. The third flavor is the very dead, and that's the organic matter that has already been decomposed by those soil organisms. It slowly releases nutrients to plants, it protects plants from harmful chemicals, it reduces compaction, and improves water retention. And by the way, my thanks to some unidentified person at Allen County Soil and Water Conservation District for the clever wording on the definitions. Compost, decomposed organic matter. It feeds microbial and small soil life, but not plants. It's good stuff. Plant food. So food is what any living organism absorbs to get energy for living. For plants, it's what's in the sky, not what's in the bag. Remember this from middle school? No? Well, chlorophyll absorbs energy from sunlight and uses that energy to recombine carbon dioxide and water into sugar. And at the same time, it releases oxygen. So the sugar is all the food that the plant needs, and the released oxygen is really good for the rest of us. Plants require very small amounts of 17 elements that act like vitamins for building healthy cells. And like vitamins, they're not plant food because they don't supply any energy. They're all found naturally in the soil or unnaturally in the bag labeled fertilizer or plant food. Mulch lies on top of the ground, has little or no nutrient value for plants, but it's great for them because it evens out temperature swings, moisture swings, reduces soil compaction, resists weeds, and if it's organic, it slowly breaks down into additional compost. All right, so we've got some workable definitions. Let's use them to talk about some important concepts. And the first one is, what do plants really want? Well, to know what a plant wants, we have to know a little about what a plant is. And what a plant is mainly water, about 90 to 95% water, all of which started in the air as rain. So this 1 pound head of lettuce is a 15-ounce puddle of water. And this General Sherman tree is 6,167 tons of total weight, which makes it 5,500 tons of water. And that's not counting another 500 to 800 gallons of water every day for transpiration. So back to our more manageable lettuce. If we look at the dried weight of the plants, 96% of that comes out of the air, including rainwater. The only part of plant weight that plants get out of the soil is the 4% of the 10% dry weight. That is, plants get less than 1/2 of 1% of their weight out of the soil. At the same time, 90 to 96% of plant weight is taken up by their roots. Even only that less than 1/2% actually originates in the soil. So the roots are really important. And the plant roots need metabolic oxygen to stay alive. And unlike the rest of the plant, oxygen for roots has to come out of the soil, not out of the air. So, knowing that about plants, now we know what they want from the soil. They want water to make up that 90 to 95% of their weight. They want nutrients to make up that 1/2 of 1%. They want oxygen to keep their roots alive, and they want a little stability so they don't fall over. So that looks like this. Ideal soil is 25% air, 25% water, and 50% solids. Good soil has that in pores that hold the air and water. Compacted soil doesn't, and really important, subsoil doesn't. All right, that's what the plant wants. Now, what do we know about soil? Well, it's got characteristics, and some of these characteristics can be changed and some can't, and it's not real obvious which is which. There's a lot about your soil that you can't really change, like origin. Here on the West Coast, the soils are volcanic, and you won't be changing that. There's a couple of others you think you might change, but can't. And there are some that are temporary or can be easily changed, not always for the better. So let's start with a couple of those changeable ones. Organic matter, structure. So we talked about organic matter. And as we saw, ground has multiple layers, and the soil layer is the only layer that will keep the plants alive because it's the only layer that has what it takes in terms of micro and macro pores to hold air and water. And it only has those pores because soil has this busy, complicated biosphere chugging away, building pores, and gluing little particles together to make larger particles and thus more pores. So organic matter needs to be constantly replenished. Now, out in the wild, the ancient wild, there were forests and grasslands that kept dying and replenishing the soil organic matter. We made all that go away. So now you, as the gardener, are responsible for replenishing the food supply necessary to keep the system going. And here in Western Oregon and Washington, that usually means adding a top dressing of a half an inch to an inch of compost to most areas annually. So here's another characteristic, structure. Now, structure is just a word, but it's an important one. It's how we say that your soil has the necessary clumps and voids to hold air and water. Another word for structure is tilth. Characteristic 4 is texture. That's the percentage of sand, clay, and silt. Why do we care? Because each of these three compounds is good for different things. Sand is good for draining water quickly, leaving big, relatively big voids for air. Clay is really good at holding water and really good at holding nutrients so that plant roots can get to them. Different plants are adapted to different soil textures. Now, as humans, we got to name everything. And because this ratio is constant, that's what we've used to name every different type of soil, like clay alone. Two important things about texture. The texture of any soil is exactly the same as the texture of its underlying subsoil. That's not surprising when you think about it, but it's still important to know. And texture is permanent and cannot be changed, and that's really important. You will never be able to change clay loam into silt loam soil. But you can improve the structure of any soil type by adding organic matter to create those necessary micro and macro pores. Clay, like diamonds, is forever, but you can give it better tilth. Why is it called texture? Here's a mimetic. Think gritty texture. Now, if you follow the arrows on this diagram, you'll see percentages of silt, sand, and clay. It should add up to about 100%. Moving on, another soil characteristic is pH, and that's the acidity or alkalinity of the soil. It ranges from 1 to 14, with 7 in the middle. And it matters because it affects how efficiently plants can take up those essential 17 elements. The important thing is how wide these green bands are. Basically, plants are very efficient at extracting the nutrients that they need over a wide range of soil pH, and moderately efficient even over the yellow area. Now, the concept here is you can nudge pH a little for a while, but then it reverts back. Long term, pH is unchangeable. So why do you care? Because while thousands of plants are well adapted to the pH we have here, You'll probably also want to grow plants that are adapted to a different pH, like apple trees or most vegetables. Nutrient content is another characteristic of soil. Most of our Western soils are rich in all of them except nitrogen, which washes out in the winter rains. If gardeners add more nutrients than the plants take up, the nutrients can continue to build up in the soil. And it's another reason that it's important to regularly get a soil test, and we'll talk more about that. And the last soil characteristic is soil depth. Now, dirt goes all the way to China. Soil only goes as deep as organic matter has been mixed with subsoil to provide those necessary pores. Again, most areas here, natural soils are a few inches to about a foot thick. And that's common around the world for areas that were once forested. Grasslands, like the Great American Midwest, have deeper soils. Grass roots are frequently much deeper than tree roots, which isn't intuitive, but it's true. The floor of the Willamette Valley has very deep soil because a lot of topsoil from eastern Washington and Oregon got washed into the valley by the Missoula floods about 14,000 years ago. But this is only true for the actual valley floor, and even there, the weight of the upper soil has compacted the lower soil, so the working soil depth is only a couple, maybe 4 feet. But homeowners face an additional problem. Building houses always involves regrading the site, which scrapes off the topsoil or buries it under excavated subsoil. So instead of getting the original fairly shallow depth, homeowners frequently get a soil depth of only a couple of inches or none at all. So how much soil depth is enough? Are we worrying about this? Well, many plants are naturally adapted to surviving on shallow soils. And many other plants will actually be growing in the thick mulch layer that you should be maintaining and will send very few roots into the actual soil. So the fact that natural soils aren't deep is not a terrible thing. But suppose you discover that your soil is not nearly as thick as you thought. What should you do? Well, we're going to talk about improving soils in just a bit. You can select the plants that are adapted to the thinner soils. And how do you know? Well, plant tags aren't much help. But if it's sold in your local nursery, that probably means some experienced person there at the nursery thinks the plant will do well here. You can see what grows well in your neighbor's yard. Take a risk, but don't gamble more than you can afford to lose. And lastly, provide plant care that's appropriate for your actual soil depth. If your lawn is growing on 2 inches of soil, you will be watering more often and less deeply than a turf grass farmer down the valley who's growing on 4 feet of soil. And if you want to plant something that came in a 12-inch deep pot, somewhere where your soil is only 3 inches deep, it will be really important that you segment the root ball and spread the roots out into a broad, shallow hole, because otherwise you'll be planting most of the roots underneath the soil layer down into the subsoil, where the roots and the plant won't do well at all. Okay, we've done some definitions. Let's put these concepts into practice. Get a real soil test. Be sure to ask for these 4 things: soil texture, pH, nutrient content, and organic matter. Now, the do-it-yourself kit from the garden center or the big box store is not accurate enough. And the free pH testing at the Master Gardener event isn't complete enough. It doesn't deal with these other issues. So I got a couple of new soil test reports a couple months ago. They cost 76 bucks each, and I got four because I have several very different conditions on my lawn. The recommendation is to retest every 3 to 5 years, and most of us don't. But do it once because that is very, very valuable. And redoing it in 8 or 10 years will probably make you feel good. It sounds expensive, but it's very well worth it. You're going to see texture, the actual percentages of sand, silt, and clay, and you'll see what that combination is called. In my case, it's loam, and that's great. You're going to see pH. You're going to see nutrient content. Now, notice how many nutrients are unnecessarily high. But look at how many nutrients are very high in the part of my yard that has never received any fertilizer or manure. Our volcanic soils are naturally rich in nutrients. So if you regularly add nutrients via fertilizer or manures, some or many of these can quickly build up and then become an environmental problem. And you may just have an excess amount of several nutrients without doing anything at all, always accepting nutrient nitrogen, which washes out in the winter rains. Now, you're also going to see soil organic matter, and this is going to be confusing. This is laboratory work. The soil sample is first dried and then burned. Don't do this at home. It will seriously stink up your house and ruin your oven. A very well-respected Cornell Ag School study recommends that for farmers growing annual crops like lettuce or wheat, driving this number of 4 to 6% is not cost effective. However, farms growing landscape plants use much higher numbers, and the numbers found in nature, where most of the plants that you want to grow, in the wild, these are much higher, usually around 10 to 14%. We're used to thinking in terms of volume. Keep thinking volume. And also critical, at the same time you do the tests, measure your soil depth. Now, relax. The hole's not going to be deep. It needs to be clean enough so that you can see what's going on. Under ideal conditions, the topsoil layer might be a foot, and for many residential sites, might be under an inch or non-existent. Rake away the mulch, dig a hole, measure the upper soil level, write it down, go check somewhere else in your yard. By the way, don't kid yourself that the thicker tan layer in this picture is topsoil. It's not. It's subsoil. Now, your ground isn't going to look like my earlier pictures. Every soil lecture uses photos that show topsoil clearly delineated from subsoil by color. But in the real world, especially when the ground is wet in winter, there may be little or no color change. But you will clearly notice a difference by how it suddenly becomes more difficult to dig into the more solid subsoil layer. And you'll clearly see roots and earthworms and other life in the upper soil layer. Your sample may actually break apart quite cleanly at the border, like this sample did. But whether it breaks or not, you'll clearly feel the difference. Check several different places. Soil depth varies a lot, even on a small city lot. So here's an interactive website that will give you great information, and it's free. Follow the instructions and see the follow the instructions on the site and see the link on the resource sheet you'll be getting. All right. We're going to talk about how to avoid ruining soil, how to improve soil, and how to make more. So first, how to avoid ruining soil? Well, keep feeding the soil life, which means regularly adding organic matter. Maintain soil moisture. Microbes and earthworms aren't happy in a desert and avoid compaction. Did you catch the theme? It's all about maintaining a deep mulch layer. How deep? Well, 3 inches is okay and 4 inches is better. There's a lot more to be said about how beneficial mulch is. See the excellent resources in the resource guide, or take Master Gardener training. We're all about using lots of mulch. And there's one more thing to avoid ruining soil. Provide oxygen, but not too much. We don't usually talk about the oxygen situation, but we used to talk about it a lot. The Great Plains was a sea of tall grass and deep-rooted soil. That soil took 2,000 years to form, and it was destroyed in 15 years. So what happened? Sure, there was a drought, but it wasn't worse than a lot of previous droughts. This guy is standing on top. He's standing on a road, and the field below him used to be at the same height. 2022 University of Massachusetts study determined that 57.6 billion tons of topsoil was lost to tilling, not pesticides or fertilizer. What happened? Well, some blew away, some washed away, some got compacted down, but mostly it got eaten by soil microbes. Opening the soil by tilling, plowing, rototilling provides a mammoth influx of oxygen to that microbial life in the soil, and the hungry population explodes. It's exactly like opening the door of your wood stove when you have a fire burning. The microbes population exploded and they were all hungry. Rototilling is worse than plowing. So after we've looked at how not to destroy your soil, there's things you can do to improve it. And mainly, you improve it by adding organic matter. Hands down, far and away, the single best thing you can do to improve what you have. Radically improves oxygen availability for the roots, radically improves water availability, seriously improves nutrient availability, better resistance to pests and diseases. Now, you could work it in, but it's much less disruptive and much easier. Just put it on top and leave it to the soil biology to drag it down. Those guys know what they're doing, and they'll do a better job. Your job is to provide the materials, compost, regularly, mulch, cover crops, and minimize disturbance. So this is probably a good time to talk about the phosphorus runoff problem. Now, you all know it's a serious problem, and you all know who the bad guys are. But a recent OSU study shows home gardens in Corvallis and Portland have problem levels of phosphorus. And the assumption is that's true everywhere. Well, these studies have been run for over 20 years all around the country, and it still comes as a surprise. Phosphorus is the middle number on this generic photoshopped bag. Our soils are naturally rich in phosphorus. You don't need to add any at all. Potassium's the third number. You don't need any more of that either. Almost all of the other required elements are in our soils already. All that most gardeners really need to add is nitrogen, that first number. Now, lawn fertilizer is basically just nitrogen, and it's perfectly good for other purposes. But please remember not to ever use weed and feed, because that'll kill your tomatoes. If you want to go organic, feather meal is a good option. Stop using manure-based compost, especially poultry manure or poultry fertilizer. Every time I include a nice technical looking slide, people want me to pause while they read it. So while you're reading, I'll just tell you that vegetation-based compost is much lower in phosphorus than manure-based compost. And cover crops are even lower. We've got a great reference article on cover crops on the resource sheet. How to improve clay soils. Okay. Well, high clay soils are very rare in Western Oregon and Washington, but everybody complains about their clay soil. Clay soil problems are almost always compaction problems or working in the soil while it's too wet problems. The most important advice for improving your so-called clay problems is to wait until the soil is dry enough to work without destroying structure, and then add organic matter, compost, a couple or 3 inches. In our areas, adding gypsum won't help, and adding calcium won't help. Our soils already have plenty of both. And whatever you do not add sand. It will just change your soil into something like bad concrete. So moving on, you can make more soil. But should you? There is no such thing as a free lunch. If you have soil and want to improve it, the strategy is straightforward and not particularly disruptive. Put down compost, let the microbial life drag it down. This will take a year or 2 or maybe 3, and after that your soil will be richer, but not deeper. If you want deeper soil, you're going to have you have 2 choices. Wait for nature, or do some serious digging and integrate a substantial amount of organic matter into the subsoil that lies underneath your soil. And unlike enriching soil, this is hard work, very disruptive, and often expensive. So why do it? Well, if you have an existing garden or landscape that is thriving, don't do it. It makes no sense to destroy a good existing landscape just to make deeper soil. But natural soils are generally not particularly thick. The good news is many, but not all plants are naturally adapted to at least survive on these shallower soils. But residential lots are always graded, with almost all the original soil either scraped off or buried. Not some of the time. Always. Always? Yeah, really. I mean, you drive your car from the road to the garage, right? The driveway required grading. You walk to the front door. That took grading. Utilities got put in. That was grading. And if you got a basement, the contractor dug it out, and the contractor spread that basement, subsoil, all over the top so he didn't have to pay for taking it away. So it doesn't make sense to destroy an existing landscape to build deeper soil. But if you're looking at a new house that has basically lost all its topsoil, it makes a lot of sense to do some serious soil building before you start landscaping. And even if you have an established landscape, if you decide you want to grow something that won't thrive in the soil depth that you have, then you might be willing to consider soil building. For instance, if you want to plant trees that'll grow large, you'll have to create much deeper soil, like 18 to 24 inches, over an area equal to substantially beyond the final drip line of the full-grown trees, or risk them blowing over. If you want to grow tomatoes and you have only a couple inches of soil, you're going to need to make some changes. Tomatoes can send their roots down 4 feet if they have the soil depth. They'll do fine in a couple of feet. but 6 or 8 inches isn't going to cut it. And if you want a real lawn, instead of struggling with the dying sod that the building contractor put down on 2 inches of fill dirt, you're going to need to increase your soil depth to at least 6 or 8 inches. In these situations, people are looking at serious soil building. Now, how does nature make more soil? Well, slowly, very slowly. Here it takes nature 500 to 2,000 years to make each inch of soil. That only works if the land's reverted to nature, so there are trees to shed leaves or weeds to die. How you make soil is different. You make soil by adding organic matter to your subsoil. You're going to put down a substantial amount of organic matter and mix it in as deep as you want your actual new soil to be. So the amount that you need to add is about 1/3 of the depth of soil that you want to make. So if you want a soil depth of 18 inches and you only have 3 inches, you'll need to dig about 5 inches of compost down the full 18-inch depth. And that means digging deep into the subsoil layer. How to dig. A garden fork is better and easier than a shovel. A broad fork is better and easier than a garden fork. 10 inches is about as deep as you can dig with a garden fork or shovel. A broad fork might get you to 14 inches, and deeper requires heavy equipment. A rototiller doesn't go anywhere near deep enough. You can use a mini excavator for larger areas, and yes, you can operate it. Have a plan to deal with compaction. Okay, yeah, you really can do this. Small ones rent for about $150 a day. With delivery and insurance, that's about $350 to $400 for a weekend. And that's long enough to redo a complete city lot. Have a plan to deal with compaction. In this case means, just like hand digging, you should always be stepping or rolling away from the area you just dug, not walking on it, or rolling on it, and also known as don't paint yourself in a corner. Rototilling is much worse than heavy equipment. Destroys the soil structure. It introduces too much oxygen. Are there alternatives to building deeper soil? Well, sure. Optimize what you have. But secondly, think about containers. Many mid-sized trees will grow happily in large containers. Don't be afraid of containers that are too big to fit in the trunk. Dealing with compacted soils. Well, it's a whole lot easier to avoid making compacted soils than to fix them. Don't dig in wet soil. Don't plant in wet soil. Don't walk on wet soil. Don't put weight on wet soil. Don't look cross-eyed at wet soil. And if you have compacted soil and it needs to be fixed, then the steps are exactly the same as the steps for making new soil. But it's often more difficult because the compacted soil may be harder to dig than your subsoil. Now, a warning. If you just break up the compacted soil without integrating substantial organic matter, it will immediately recompact, immediately being as soon as it rains. Okay, let's look at a different problem. Water doesn't pass between soils with different textures. This is a concept that at first seems highly unlikely, and then it seems sort of irrelevant. But it turns out to be the key to solving a whole raft of common garden problems. Here's an experiment. Here's an aquarium filled with a layer of good soil, topped with a thin layer of clay soil, topped with a thicker layer of the same good soil, and water is dripped into the container. the water doesn't move into the lower soil layer until both upper layers are completely saturated. And we assume the water's being blocked by the clay, right? Well, it's probably not. Watch this. Same container, this time, soil layer directly over a layer of highly porous sand and gravel. And surprise, no water movement into the sand and gravel until the upper layer is completely saturated. And that is not expected, but it's absolutely real. By the way, we've got a great link to a video of this. You'll see it on the resource sheet. Now, this reality of soil interface problems shows up as practical problems in several places, using fill dirt, digging planting holes, selecting soil to fill raised beds. So, fill dirt is not your friend. Adding a layer of fill dirt to your yard will cause drainage problems. Not may, will. People blame it on the compaction. That's not it, although compaction's always bad. And unfortunately, just adding organic matter is not going to solve the problem, much as I like organic matter. If you absolutely must bring in fill, think, plan. Look at how deep your existing soil is. Decide on the level that you want your final grade. Your final result should be a consistent mix of your existing topsoil, new topsoil with the same texture, and about 1/3 compost. Make up a little extra height to compensate for settling and initial organic decomposition. Now, the soil that you bring in can be topsoil or subsoil, but it absolutely must have the same texture. So if you have silty loam, you must bring in silty loam. You can get this from organizations called agricultural soils suppliers. They exist, and it'll cost you a little bit more than buying it off Craigslist, but not a whole lot. Of course, they deliver. Second place is planting stuff. Now, when you're digging, let's take it from the top. When you're planting, dig a broad, shallow hole because your soil layer is shallow. And don't amend the backfill because you want to eliminate as many of these interface problems as you can. But there is an even better way, and that's this thing called root washing. And root washing removes the original soil from that potted or B&B plant. So you end up with one soil type, no interface, and basically what you're doing is turning your potted or B&B plant into a bare root plant before you plant it, which is a scary thought. And it probably shouldn't be done when the temperature is high in summer and the plant needs lots of transpiration water. And you definitely need to remember to muddy in the plant with lots of water while you're adding back the native soil backfill so the roots are moist and fully in contact. But it really works, and it significantly improves both growth and survival rates. The third place this interface problem shows up is filling a raised bed. And for common 1 and 2 board low beds, there is one obviously superior solution. Add 6 inches or more of organic matter, compost, into the existing soil, or subsoil if that's what you have. And this will pretty much fill up a low bed. In subsequent years, add about 1 inch of compost to replace the organic matter that gets lost to decomposition. Tall beds are trickier, but you've got options. First, you could find additional soil or subsoil on your site, integrating it into the underlying soil, and mixing in about 1/3 compost by volume. That's an excellent solution. But unless you have real acreage, you're not going to find the material. And scraping off the last of your thin soil to fill a raised bed is not a wise use of scarce materials. So this strategy won't work for a lot of people. You can fill the empty bed either with 100% potting mix or potting mix with about 1/3 of the volume made up of real soil, or just fill the bed with a purchased raised bed mix or three-way mix. All of these are acceptable, but recognize that you've created a drainage problem, as the soil in the bed will be different than the soil under the bed. The water is not going to drain into the lower soil. So drill new drainage holes in the sides of the bed near the bottom. On the resource sheet, you're going to see reference to a good article on soils for raised beds from University of Maryland Extension. Organic matter is always going to shrink because it's always being eaten. And any silt, sand, or clay will not be eaten. So when you top up your beds, top them up just with organic matter. But this gardener on the left apparently started with a mix that was almost all organic matter. And they should probably top up with a more balanced mix since they're basically starting over. Just remember, the material that vanishes is being eaten by microbial life. It's not being taken up by the plants. And it's being eaten faster than you think. Now, on the chart, the red line is compost, with 20% being lost after about 80 days. And the blue line is uncomposted material like leaves or cover crop materials, with 50% being lost after the same 80 days. Vegetable gardens we talked about. There's always questions, so a brief repeat. Dig in 6 inches of organic matter as deeply as possible. Double dig if possible. This might be the one place it is actually a good idea. Don't rototill, and top up annually with about 1 inch of compost. Mulch, cover crop, or both. Excellent reference in the resource sheet for very complete information about cover crops and what each one is best for. Your existing landscape. Avoid compaction. Now here, that means go cut yourself a piece of plywood about 1.5 feet square. And when you're working in your beds, stand on the board instead of tromping around and compacting the soil. Top up annually. Mulch, mulch, mulch. No bare dirt. So no bare dirt is a great mantra for gardeners. Rain will compact exposed ground. If it doesn't have a plant growing on it, put down a thick layer of mulch. If it does have a plant growing on it, put down a thick layer of mulch. So here's a caveat. All the terms and all the concepts given here are standard and fully supported in the scientific literature. The specific thicknesses of compost are all from OSU literature and are appropriate for this area, but different authors make slightly different recommendations because compost varies widely, decomposition varies widely with season and temperature, and soil varies. So what did we learn? Well, plants are very specific about what they need for very good reasons. In your soil layer, the only part of your dirt that your plants can actually use is naturally thinner than you thought. And yours is probably much thinner because of how your lot got graded when your house was built. So think about your actual soil depth when you make decisions about what to plant and how to care for it. It's pretty easy to maintain and to improve your soil. Avoid creating phosphorus pollution by avoiding general purpose fertilizers and animal manures. And you can make new soil, additional soil depth, but it's hard work, very disruptive, and not appropriate for every situation. Soil's got specific characteristics. Some are changeable, some are not. Invest in a real soil test. Know what you really have. And there's a real but invisible interface between soils of different types. And this creates serious problems, but they can be avoided. Act consciously to avoid compaction. It's easy to get, hard to fix. Rototilling's really bad, even if you're careful. Now you're going to read, even on our recommendations, people will say rototill carefully. Just don't rototill at all. Your soil is thin, old, and fragile. Take care of it.
I think the information covered a lot of topics. The one thing that will be good to discuss a little bit more about is compost. And specifically, I mean buying commercially made compost. We know there have been some issues with persistent herbicide presence in compost in the Portland metro area. And I think it may be helpful if you'd like to say a little bit more about just give people tips about, what they should look for, how to source good compost.
Oh, all true. I don't have good answers. Um, the good answer, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense for home gardeners, is to do a bioassay. The problem, it doesn't really work for home gardeners because yes, you can go out and find like a bulk supplier and they'll give you a little and you go plant some stuff in it. And if it sprouts, then go back and buy more. But by the time you've done that, they've sold everything that was in that bin and they have a new batch in. Where do we go with this? You're right. And it is a persistent problem. What we really need is a state standard for compost, and there isn't one.
Okay, so I yeah, I think it's important for us to point out that there are protocols for doing bioassay. There are Department of Agriculture, the State Department of Agriculture oversight of compost facilities, but they don't do regular testing. So there is no sure way to know the compost you buy does not have persistent herbicide. However, you do have the ability to ask at various places a couple of things. The first one is, are they part of the U.S. Composting Council? Because the membership requires them to do regular testing. So it does not guarantee your batch shows the test result. However, it is a requirement that makes its membership a little more aware and vigilant in terms of the compost quality. And the second thing is you can certainly ask them for the test result. Again, it's not a guarantee of the quality of your batch, but you can find out about their testing protocol, frequency, get the result, take a look at it. And I think the final thing is you can ask the source of the materials that they use to put into the compost piles, because we know the persistent herbicide tend to be associated with farming operations and bedding. So if so you so so you can decipher somewhat just from the source material and
Do we think that,
imperfect answers.
yeah, do we think that if it's sourced from yard debris, it's likely to be better than if it's sourced from agriculture?
Yeah, if it's not from farms, it has a lesser issue. Obviously, persistent herbicide could be used in
Yeah.
home gardens, but it tends to be less and it tends to be smaller quantities from a yard as opposed to a farm. So anyway, I just, I don't want to beat this to death because there is no sure way to
Yeah.
know. But
Yeah.
I want to point that out because compost factors so heavily into this presentation. And with that, I think we should end this webinar. We're almost an hour into it. Thank you, Justin, for all the research you've done. And um, until next time, happy gardening.